The man who reached the absolute summit of power as the highest paid actor on the planet ultimately took his final breaths in a squalid clinic on the Mexican border, his lungs packed with the toxic byproducts of corporate greed. Throughout the peak of his career, Steve McQueen was trapped for tens of thousands of hours under the cheap asbestos-laced roofs of Hollywood sound stages, where a constant snow of toxic white dust was directly traded for tens of millions of dollars in box office revenue. The maverick who arrogantly defied death in blockbuster action sequences ultimately suffocated in agonizing decay, becoming the most tragic and perfectly concealed victim of the Hollywood meat grinder. Long before he became an invincible cinematic icon, his childhood offered no romantic Western vistas, only the bleak reality of industrial poverty. A transient mother and an absent father left him entirely vulnerable to the harsh mechanisms of survival. He was passed around to relatives and eventually discarded into the reform school system. The Boys' Republic facility taught him conformity through sheer physical exhaustion and strict discipline. He learned very early that human labor was the only acceptable currency for a bed and a meal. This foundational programming perfectly primed him for a lifetime of exploited labor. He viewed the world as a transactional hierarchy, where the worker always bleeds for the boss. Seeking refuge from the streets, he signed his life over to the United States military. The Marine Corps did not see a rebellious spirit, they saw an expendable unit of physical labor. They sent him into the dark, stifling bowels of naval transport ships to perform maintenance. It was inside these steel corridors that he received his first lethal dose of industrial negligence. The military ordered him to strip aged insulation off the endless maze of steam pipes. The air in the ship's underbelly hung thick with a blinding toxic white dust. He breathed in millions of microscopic asbestos fibers during every grueling 12-hour shift. The government provided zero respiratory protection and issued no health warnings to their enlisted laborers. The microscopic razors settled deep inside his chest cavity, establishing a silent, permanent foothold. He scrubbed the lethal powder off his skin, completely unaware of the biological time bomb ticking in his lungs. The military-industrial complex treated his physical health as a completely disposable commodity. They squeezed the labor out of his youth and spat him back into the civilian workforce. He was a veteran with a meager stipend, drifting into the concrete canyons of New York City. He scoured the city for a wage, driven by the ingrained fear of starvation. Someone explained that the theater paid a living wage just for standing on a stage and reciting words. He viewed the stage entirely as a blue-collar trade, a desperate physical hustle to avoid the freezing bread lines. Memorizing dialogue was simply another form of manual labor required to secure a weekly paycheck. The predatory gaze of talent scouts soon locked onto his raw, unpolished grit. The theater patrons loved the hungry, desperate look burning behind his eyes. He lacked the refined, aristocratic polish of stage-trained elites from the acting conservatories. This working-class authenticity made him a cheap, pliable commodity for the expanding television networks. They handed him standard boilerplate contracts designed to strip away all his personal agency. Early live television operated exactly like a punishing industrial assembly line. Actors hit their marks, delivered the corporate sponsor's message, and vanished back into the shadows. The shooting schedules ran on an unforgiving, non-stop loop that shattered the human nervous system. Sleep deprivation became standard operating procedure for the entire cast and crew. He survived the grueling broadcast purely on nicotine, cheap coffee, and sheer economic desperation. The New York television studios held their own hidden, microscopic terrors. To block out the deafening roar of city traffic, executives insulated the sound stages with the cheapest materials available. They packed the walls and ceilings with heavy layers of industrial-grade asbestos. The hot studio lights baked the insulation, sending a constant invisible snow of toxic fibers onto the actors below. He was trading his respiratory health for a meager television salary without ever knowing it. The West Coast studio bosses needed fresh blood to feed their massive film slates. They watched his television spots and saw a highly exploitable demographic appeal. The executives dispatched lawyers armed with multi-picture deals to lock him down in California. These contracts offered a deceptive illusion of financial security to a man terrified of poverty. In reality, they legally bound his physical autonomy to a ruthless corporate structure. He packed his meager belongings and headed toward the blinding sun of the California desert. The promise of steady pay blinded him to the predatory clauses buried deep in the paperwork. He arrived at the studio gates viewing himself as a fortunate, employed worker. The executive gatekeepers viewed him strictly as raw material ready for processing. The Hollywood extraction machine was fully primed to consume his youth and his health. Studio bosses meticulously engineered his public persona, erasing his troubled background to craft a highly marketable rebel archetype. Encased in specific denim and leather uniforms, every public appearance became a calculated performance. He had become a trademarked property. The shifting cinematic landscape soon demanded grittier, more dangerous spectacles from its leading men. The studios realized they could leverage his natural athleticism to drastically cut production corners. Hiring dedicated stunt professionals cost extra money and complicated the rigid shooting schedules. Directors started pressuring him to perform his own high-speed vehicular maneuvers. They disguised this cynical cost-cutting measure as a request for artistic authenticity. He foolishly agreed to take the physical risks, desperate to prove his value to the bosses. The executives smiled in their offices as their insurance premiums remained artificially low. Every time he slid a motorcycle into the dirt, the studio banked the surplus cash. He believed he was cementing his status as an indispensable asset to the company. He was actually establishing a lethal precedent of unpaid, highly hazardous labor. The sound stages were entirely unregulated industrial zones run by profit-driven foremen. The massive lighting grids pumped out scorching, suffocating heat over the unventilated sets. The air hung thick with cigarette smoke, sawdust, and toxic chemical solvents. Grips and electricians collapsed from heat stroke with alarming regularity on the concrete floors. The studio bosses never paused the rolling cameras for a medical emergency. The production companies kept compliant, unscrupulous physicians on the permanent payroll. These doctors handed out amphetamines like candy to keep exhausted actors awake during grueling night shoots. They freely distributed heavy barbiturates to force the cast to sleep when the sun finally came up. The studio medical wing operated as an illicit chemical dispensary for the factory line. Their sole job was to keep the assets standing, never to ensure long-term occupational health. Productions frequently dragged the crews out into unforgiving desert environments to save on-set construction. The extreme temperature swings punished the human body without an ounce of mercy. The caterers provided substandard cheap food to the crew, while the executives dined off-site. The actors baked in heavy costumes while waiting hours for the lighting crew to finish their setups. Every hour spent in the blistering sun drained his finite physical reserves. Stardom slowly and deliberately severed his connections to normal everyday society. The studio publicist strictly dictated who he could speak with and where he could be photographed. They built a gilded, isolating cage around their most profitable financial investment. He was perpetually surrounded by handlers, agents, and yes men paid to keep him compliant and working. The psychological isolation forced him to internalize his mounting anxiety and physical pain. The marketing department actively sold him to the world as a defiant, uncontrollable maverick. They planted fabricated stories in the press about his supposed screaming matches with directors. This manufactured rebellion gave ticket buyers exactly what they wanted to see on the screen. Behind closed doors, he followed the punishing production schedules to the exact letter. True rebellion would have resulted in an immediate, career-ending breach of contract lawsuit. His face became the most heavily insured component on the entire studio lot. Yet the rest of his body was treated as completely expendable machinery. The directors routinely placed him mere inches away from explosive squibs and galloping horses. A mistimed cue or a mechanical failure could have shattered his spine or crushed his skull. The studio executives calculated these life or death risks entirely in terms of box office returns. A deep systemic fatigue began to settle permanently into his bones. A standard weekend of rest was no longer enough to recover from a 6-day shooting schedule. The constant adrenaline spikes from performing dangerous stunts left his nervous system completely frayed. He masked the rapid physical deterioration with a stoic, unbreakable silence. Showing any physical weakness on a Hollywood lot was the fastest way to lose all contract leverage. He became a prisoner of his own manufactured success. As his global ticket sales increased, executives squeezed production schedules tighter, offering absolutely no time to heal or rest. He traded his sweat, safety, and sanity for the illusion of control, completely unaware that the industry was now preparing to extract the final ounces of value from his physical body. The demand for visceral adrenaline became the studio's primary revenue generator. Audiences grew bored of static sound stages and painted backdrops. Executives needed a new high-stakes spectacle to keep the quarterly profit margins expanding. They mandated high-speed vehicular warfare on real, unpredictable city streets. This production shift transferred the physical hazard entirely onto the on-camera labor force. Hiring specialized drivers for these complex urban sequences cut into the production budget. The boardrooms quickly discovered a highly efficient loophole. They manipulated their leading man's working-class pride to save the studio millions. Directors challenged his physical courage, subtly threatening to replace him with a double. He swallowed the bait completely and strapped himself into the driver's seat. The executives publicly praised his dedication to authentic cinema. Behind closed doors, they categorized his willingness to absorb impact as a free line item. Every tire squeal and near-miss collision translated directly to surplus capital. He believed he was outsmarting the system by demanding creative control over the vehicles. In reality, he was simply volunteering for uncompensated, life-threatening industrial labor. The speeds increased, and the probability of a fatal incident skyrocketed. The insurance underwriters finally panicked at the sheer statistical risk of losing their primary asset. They threatened to pull coverage unless the studio implemented immediate safety protocols. The corporate machine responded with a cynical, cost-effective solution. They equipped the labor force with the cheapest protective gear available on the industrial market. Wardrobe departments measured him for specialized fire-retardant racing suits. The studio medical liaisons proudly presented this equipment as a technological marvel of safety. They handed him thick balaclavas, heavy gloves, and multi-layered driving overalls. The actor accepted the gear, trusting the corporation to protect his physical well-being. He was entirely unaware that he was stepping into a wearable chemical prison. The miracle fireproofing material woven into these garments was industrial asbestos. The executives authorized the purchase of these specific suits purely based on wholesale pricing. They ignored the decades of existing medical literature regarding the mineral's toxic properties. Protecting a human lung was never part of the fiscal equation. They only needed a suit that would keep the skin intact long enough to finish the picture. The physical mechanics of operating high-performance vehicles demanded maximum cardiovascular output. The enclosed cabins of the stunt cars lacked any form of ventilation or climate control. Engine heat baked the metal interiors to suffocating oven-like temperatures. He sat strapped inside these steel boxes for hours while the camera crews adjusted their lenses. The heavy asbestos suit trapped his body heat, forcing him to gasp for oxygen. Every desperate, heavy breath he took inside that helmet became an act of self-destruction. The friction of his movement continuously frayed the cheap linings of the safety gear. Microscopic, jagged fibers of asbestos broke loose from the fabric collars and balaclavas. They floated invisibly inside the cramped space between his mouth and the visor. He inhaled thousands of these toxic particles with every single take. The fibers bypassed his natural respiratory defenses and drove themselves deep into his pleural lining. The studio had successfully engineered a highly efficient delivery system for industrial poison. They labeled it a safety protocol to satisfy the insurance adjusters. The actor believed the heavy suit was shielding him from a fiery demise. It was actually injecting a permanent lethal mutation directly into his chest cavity. The extraction process only intensified as the box office receipts shattered industry records. The studio greenlit international productions revolving entirely around professional endurance racing. The scripts demanded he operate unstable prototypes at maximum velocity on rain-slicked European asphalt. The shooting schedule stretched into grueling multi-month marathons of sleep deprivation. The executives demanded authentic exhaustion for the cameras, and they received it. The wardrobe department supplied him with a fresh rotation of toxic racing suits. He practically lived inside the asbestos-lined gear from dawn until dusk. The production denied the crew proper rest facilities, forcing them to sleep in the dirt and oil of the pit lanes. He absorbed the mechanical vibrations of the engines until his hands permanently shook. The studio bosses monitored the dailies from pristine, air-conditioned screening rooms in California. When the international productions finally wrapped, the punishment merely shifted back to American soil. The Hollywood sound stages offered a different yet equally lethal method of exposure. The cavernous warehouses used to shoot interior scenes were acoustic nightmares. To dampen the echoes and insulate the tin roofs, the studios sprayed the ceilings with thick chemical compounds. They chose asbestos because it was the cheapest fire-retardant acoustic material on the market. Just like in New York, the scorching lighting grids baked the insulation daily, sending a constant invisible snow of toxic fibers drifting down onto the unventilated production floor. Internal corporate memos calculating the risk of worker illness were routinely buried. Executives decided it was cheaper to simply replace sick crew members than to upgrade the facilities. He spent countless hours sitting under those lights, waiting for the directors to call action. He breathed deeply to center himself before delivering his lines. Every inhalation pulled the falling debris straight into his respiratory tract. The studio charged him for the water he drank on set, but provided the poisoned air for free. He was being slowly hollowed out by the very infrastructure designed to make him famous. The macho trap of his leading man persona kept him completely silent about his physical discomfort. Complaining about the dust or a persistent cough was viewed as a sign of weakness. The studio foreman actively fired crew members who questioned the working conditions. He understood that maintaining his position at the top required absolute, unquestioning compliance. He chose to ignore the tightness in his chest to protect his weekly paycheck. The executives actively weaponized his working-class work ethic against him. They knew he possessed a psychological compulsion to outwork everyone else on the lot. They handed him grueling shooting schedules that would break a normal laborer. He pushed through the exhaustion, believing his endurance proved his worth to the industry. The studio merely saw a machine that required zero maintenance downtime. To maintain the illusion of the stoic, unbreakable cowboy, he had to hide the accumulating damage. His joints ached from the unpadded stunt impacts, and his lungs burned from the chemical exposure. The studio physicians offered zero diagnostic care, only temporary patches. They handed him stronger painkillers and told him to get back in front of the lens. The medical staff operated as corporate mechanics, authorized only to keep the engine running until the film wrapped. He began self-medicating heavily to survive the brutal transitions between locations. The studio executives turned a completely blind eye to his escalating reliance on alcohol. As long as he hit his marks and delivered the required dialogue, his off-camera deterioration was irrelevant. They actually preferred a compromised star, as addiction made him easier to control during contract negotiations. A desperate worker is far less likely to demand a safe working environment. His physical degradation was a direct mathematical result of corporate efficiency. The executives squeezed millions of dollars out of his willingness to wear cheap, lethal safety gear. They saved millions more by refusing to strip the toxic insulation from their aging sound stages. He was trapped in a completely enclosed ecosystem of exploitation and chemical poisoning. The illusion of his on-screen invincibility was masking a rapidly accelerating internal catastrophe. The sheer volume of asbestos he inhaled over a decade of continuous filming was staggering. The military had provided the initial foundational exposure in the shipyards, but the Hollywood machine delivered the sustained daily dosage required to trigger a fatal cellular mutation. They locked him in the unventilated cars and the snowy sound stages until the damage was irreversible. The studio system did not just employ him, it actively and methodically contaminated him. Audiences worldwide cheered as they watched him outrun villains and law enforcement on the screen. They had no idea they were watching a man actively suffocating under his own wardrobe. The high-speed chases and the rugged close-ups were nothing more than beautifully photographed industrial accidents. He was trading the microscopic integrity of his lungs for a temporary spike in the box office charts. The transaction was completely rigged, and the executives held all the winning cards. Every new contract he signed tightened the noose of his own exploitation. He fought ruthlessly for higher percentages of the gross profits, believing money could buy his freedom. He did not realize that the currency he was accumulating was entirely useless against the damage already inflicted. The studio bosses gladly paid him his exorbitant fees, knowing they had already extracted his most valuable asset. They bought his health at a steep discount and sold it to the public at a massive premium. The relentless pace of production left him no time to seek independent medical evaluations. The studio controlled his schedule so tightly that he rarely saw life outside the perimeter of the set. He was isolated from objective reality, surrounded by corporate sycophants who praised his stamina. They applauded his grit while he quietly coughed in the shadows between takes. The Hollywood extraction machine was operating precisely as designed, leaving nothing but a hollow shell behind. The cellular mutation operated in complete silence beneath his ribcage. Mesothelioma requires decades to weave its fatal web across the pleural lining. The microscopic asbestos fibers he inhaled on the sound stages had permanently scarred his internal tissue. These jagged foreign bodies triggered a relentless, unnatural division of cells. A hardened tumor began to encase his right lung like an iron vise. He felt the initial restriction of airflow during a grueling desert shoot. A sharp, stinging pressure radiated through his chest every time he inhaled deeply. He dismissed the pain as a simple pulled muscle from another unpadded stunt. The studio schedule allowed absolutely no time for a proper medical examination. He swallowed a handful of aspirin and walked back into the suffocating heat of the set. The physical toll of the untreated illness quickly compounded the daily exhaustion of production. His legendary stamina began to fracture under the weight of a failing respiratory system. Running across an arid landscape for a wide-angle shot left him dizzy and gasping. He learned to control his breathing meticulously whenever the cameras rolled. Showing any visible sign of physical distress was a guaranteed ticket to unemployment. To maintain the illusion of peak physical dominance, he required external chemical assistance. He transitioned from simple painkillers to a highly regimented cocktail of illicit narcotics. The actor snorted stimulants in his trailer just to force his exhausted body upright. The artificial adrenaline spiked his heart rate and pushed the fatigue into the background. He was chemically overriding his biological warning systems to keep the corporate masters satisfied. When the director yelled "cut," the artificial energy immediately evaporated. His heart palpitated wildly as the narcotics clashed with his failing lung capacity. To bring his nervous system down enough to sleep, he consumed dangerous quantities of alcohol. He washed down heavy sedatives with cheap liquor in the isolation of his dressing room. This lethal pharmaceutical pendulum swung daily just to keep the production on schedule. The studio executives were entirely aware of his escalating chemical dependency. Corporate handlers monitored his trailer and documented his erratic behavior for the legal department. They never intervened to offer rehabilitation or genuine medical support. They viewed his addiction strictly as a valuable point of leverage for future contract negotiations. A compromised, dependent star could not effectively argue against a punishing shooting schedule. His behavioral volatility on set was carefully weaponized by the marketing department. The publicists leaked stories of his temper tantrums to feed his rebellious public persona. Audiences equated his off-screen instability with authentic, untamed masculinity. They bought tickets to see a dangerous maverick defying authority. They were actually funding the systematic chemical destruction of a terrified working-class laborer. As the disease advanced, his lung capacity diminished to terrifying levels. He developed a persistent wet cough that rattled deep within his chest cavity. Makeup artists applied heavier layers of foundation to hide the sickly pallor of his skin. Wardrobe designers quietly tailored his jackets to conceal his rapidly shrinking frame. The entire production crew became complicit in masking a fatal industrial disease. He reached the absolute summit of the Hollywood financial hierarchy. His agents secured a contract making him the highest-paid employee in the global entertainment sector. He commanded a staggering percentage of the first dollar gross profits. The actor believed this unprecedented wealth finally provided an impenetrable shield against exploitation. He assumed he had finally purchased his freedom from the meat grinder. The executives signed the historic contract with cold, calculated indifference. They ran the actuarial tables and determined his box office draw still outweighed his salary. They simply viewed his exorbitant fee as a standard capital investment. The studio bosses knew they controlled his physical output, regardless of the zeros on his paycheck. He was still a biological machine entirely dependent on their infrastructure. To maintain his bankability, he engineered elaborate deceptions on the set. He hired personal assistants whose sole job was to intercept any medical inquiries from the producers. These loyal employees smuggled supplementary oxygen tanks into his private trailer. Between takes, he would desperately inhale pure oxygen just to stabilize his heart rate. He was secretly running a miniature intensive care unit out of his dressing room. The executives noticed his frequent retreats to the trailer, but chose willful ignorance. They attributed his absences to the stereotypical, erratic behavior of a pampered superstar. Investigating his health would require a formal medical disclosure, which could trigger an insurance default. The financial department ordered the producers to stop asking questions and simply keep the cameras rolling. Ignorance was a highly calculated, legally protective strategy for the studio. He utilized complex wardrobe tricks to hide his severe weight loss from the lenses. Tailors padded the shoulders of his iconic jackets to maintain the illusion of a broad, muscular frame. He wore thick, layered sweaters, even during scenes shot in the sweltering heat. The physical exertion of simply standing upright in the heavy clothing drained his remaining energy. The camera captured a powerful hero, completely missing the skeletal structure trembling beneath the fabric. The sheer terror of his biological decline warped his psychological state. He became hypervigilant, suspecting studio executives of planting spies within his inner circle. He abruptly fired longtime managers and agents, believing they were conspiring to replace him. This paranoia was a direct byproduct of working within a system that treated humans like commodities. He knew the machine would not hesitate to scrap him the moment his weakness was verified. His final film performances were masterclasses in pain management. He delivered lengthy dialogue sequences by meticulously parsing his breath into short, calculated bursts. The editors praised his deliberate, measured delivery as a brilliant artistic acting choice. They had no idea they were praising the respiratory limitations of a dying man. His physical suffering was seamlessly repackaged as award-winning cinematic gravity. The financial compensation for these final projects was astronomical. The studios paid his unprecedented quotes because his name still guaranteed international distribution. He stockpiled the cash in offshore accounts and trust funds, preparing for the inevitable collapse. He believed this accumulated capital would secure a fortress around his physical health. He failed to realize that the poison circulating in his bloodstream recognized no currency. The paranoia began to consume him as the internal pain grew unmanageable. He isolated himself behind high walls, refusing to engage with the Hollywood social elite. He demanded closed sets, banning unauthorized executives from watching him work. This isolation was not driven by arrogance or artistic ego. It was a desperate survival mechanism to hide his failing body from the corporate predators. He knew the exact moment the studio deemed him physically compromised, his career would vanish. The industry operates on a strict policy of zero tolerance for defective merchandise. He pushed himself through one final agonizing production to secure his financial legacy. Every spoken line required a monumental effort just to draw enough breath. He was literally suffocating on camera, while the director praised his stoic performance. The breaking point arrived without warning in a sterile bathroom. He coughed violently into a white porcelain sink and saw the bright red spray of arterial blood. The absolute verifiable proof of his internal destruction could no longer be hidden with makeup or padding. He could no longer mask the systemic collapse with narcotics and stubborn pride. The biological time bomb had officially detonated. A private physician finally delivered the devastating terminal diagnosis. The doctor identified the rare, lethal cancer scaling across his pleural lining. The medical professional explained the direct correlation between his illness and industrial asbestos exposure. He realized instantly that the cheap racing suits and the dusty sound stages had doomed him. The corporation had successfully poisoned him in plain sight. He possessed millions of dollars in the bank and unparalleled global fame. Yet the finest oncologists in the American medical system offered him zero hope. They declared the tumor entirely inoperable due to its proximity to his heart. The doctors prescribed heavy morphine and suggested he put his legal affairs in order. The healthcare system simply stamped an expiration date on his forehead and sent him home. The secret he guarded so fiercely was suddenly a verifiable medical crisis. He was forced to cancel his upcoming production slates, triggering an immediate breach of contract. The corporate wolves instantly descended to reclaim their investments. The legal notices arrived at his private estate via ruthless corporate couriers. The studios did not send flowers. They sent immediate demands for the return of advance payments. The executives convened emergency meetings solely to assess their financial exposure, calculating the potential losses on his unproduced projects without a single mention of medical treatments or condolences. The legal departments mobilized instantly to sever all existing ties. They invoked obscure morality clauses and physical capability mandates to void his contracts. The very same executives who handed him the toxic safety gear now labeled him a liability. They successfully insulated the corporation from any legal responsibility for his exposure. The blame was entirely shifted onto his lifestyle choices and his history of smoking. They locked him out of his own production offices and seized his development properties. The systematic erasure of his legacy began while he was still breathing. His phone stopped ringing entirely within 48 hours of the leak. The sycophants, handlers, and studio liaisons vanished like ghosts in the daylight. The industry completely excommunicated the man who had built their summer box office empires. He was no longer a revenue-generating asset, so he ceased to exist in their ecosystem. The king of the silver screen was instantly reduced to an unemployed, dying liability. No studio head publicly acknowledged the lethality of their own sound stages. They launched a coordinated, silent blackout regarding the presence of asbestos on their lots. Acknowledging his true cause of death would invite thousands of lawsuits from the blue-collar crew members. They chose to let their superstar shoulder the blame for his own failing health. The corporate machine protected its profit margins with total unyielding silence. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical pain radiating through his chest. He had traded his entire youth, his sanity, and his bodily autonomy to serve the studios. He performed their stunts, wore their cheap equipment, and generated their record-breaking dividends. When the bill for that labor finally came due, they locked the gates. He was left entirely alone to face a terrifying, suffocating demise. He refused to accept the death sentence handed down by the American establishment. The working-class survivor within him demanded one final desperate fight against the odds. He leveraged his remaining fortune to scour the globe for an alternative cure. This blind desperation made him the perfect target for a new breed of predators. He packed his bags and prepared to cross the southern border. He instructed his remaining staff to liquidate specific assets to generate untraceable cash. He needed liquid capital to fund his clandestine escape across the international lines. The actor packed his medical files and prepared to abandon the country that built him. He was a dying laborer seeking a miracle in the shadows. The final agonizing chapter of his exploitation was waiting for him in a foreign clinic. He crossed the southern border under the cover of absolute secrecy. A chartered flight carried the discarded asset away from the gleaming California sound stages. The American medical establishment had officially categorized him as a lost cause. He carried bags of untraceable cash to fund a desperate rogue operation. The actor was fleeing the very system that had engineered his physical collapse. The destination was a heavily guarded compound tucked away in the Mexican desert. The Plaza Santa Maria Clinic projected the calming illusion of a wellness sanctuary. In reality, it operated as a highly organized, unregulated extraction facility. The operators targeted wealthy terminal patients who had exhausted all legitimate medical avenues. They preyed specifically on the human refusal to accept a fatal biological verdict. An unlicensed American orthodontist named William Kelly orchestrated this underground medical syndicate. He possessed zero oncology credentials and held no valid medical licenses. Kelly manufactured a pseudo-scientific protocol he relentlessly marketed as a universal cancer cure. The American authorities had legally barred him from practicing medicine across state lines. He simply relocated his predatory enterprise to a jurisdiction with zero oversight. The clinic operators recognized the incoming patient strictly as their ultimate financial windfall, a walking, breathing vault filled with Hollywood capital. The staff immediately confiscated his legitimate pain medication upon his arrival. They replaced his pharmaceutical safeguards with an agonizing, scientifically baseless regimen. The underground clinic subjected him to a humiliating and biologically destructive regimen. Operators stripped his failing body of vital hydration through relentless purging protocols, masking the damage with unsterilized injections of animal proteins. He swallowed dozens of unregulated raw enzyme supplements daily, eroding his stomach lining while the administrators quietly drained his offshore accounts for every single pill. The physical reality of the treatment was a horrific escalation of his suffering. The unsterilized injections created painful welts across his shrinking muscles. The constant purging left him too weak to walk down the clinic hallways unassisted. He spent his days confined to a sterile bed, trembling violently from the artificial treatments. The operators recorded his suffering as evidence of the cancer leaving his body. To maintain his compliance, the clinic engineered a sophisticated psychological manipulation. The staff presented him with fabricated laboratory results indicating miraculous cellular regeneration. They printed fake medical charts showing his tumor shrinking by the millimeter. He lacked the scientific literacy to decode the fraudulent data placed in front of him. The actor genuinely believed he was purchasing his own biological salvation. The clinic operators eventually realized they could no longer hide his physical deterioration. The mesothelioma bypassed their fraudulent treatments and began spreading rapidly into his neck and abdomen. The tumors expanded, crushing his internal organs and restricting his digestive tract. He lost the ability to swallow the handfuls of mandated pancreatic enzymes. His weight plummeted drastically, revealing the severe malnutrition caused by the facility. The pain escalated far beyond the threshold of human endurance. The cancerous growths pressed directly against the nerve clusters in his spinal column. The operators refused to provide legitimate morphine, insisting it would reverse their fabricated progress. They forced him to endure the agony through sheer willpower and meditation. This denial of palliative care was the most barbaric component of their financial scheme. He spent the agonizing nights staring at the ceiling, gasping for shallow pockets of air. The tumor in his chest had grown to the size of a grapefruit, displacing his heart. The cheap racing suits and the asbestos sound stages had finally completed their microscopic mission. The actor realized the orthodontist's promises were entirely hollow. He was trapped in a foreign country, completely devoid of legitimate medical support. He demanded an immediate consultation with an actual board-certified surgeon. The clinic staff attempted to block the request, fearing the exposure of their fraudulent operation. They threatened to terminate his treatment protocol if he sought outside intervention. The actor utilized his remaining shreds of authority to bypass the administrators. He authorized his representatives to locate a surgical team willing to take his money. The search for a compliant surgeon proved incredibly difficult. American doctors universally refused to operate on a patient with such advanced metastasized tumors. They categorized the proposed surgery as a completely irrational and fatal endeavor. The liability risks of losing a global icon on the operating table were simply too high. The established medical hierarchy had permanently locked him out of their system. He finally located a local Mexican surgical team willing to perform the procedure. These doctors did not operate under the strict ethical guidelines of the American Medical Board. They viewed his desperate request as a highly lucrative, off-the-books cash transaction. The surgeons agreed to open his chest cavity and attempt to excise the heavy growths. They demanded full payment up front in untraceable currency before scrubbing into the theater. The clinic administrators realized they were losing control of their primary asset. They orchestrated a highly publicized press conference to distance themselves from the upcoming surgery. The orthodontist stood before the cameras and claimed his treatments had successfully cured the cancer. He blamed the actor's lingering issues strictly on dead tissue that simply needed surgical removal. This was a calculated legal maneuver to dodge responsibility for his inevitable demise. The actor prepared to leave the wellness sanctuary for the final time. He was transported out of the facility under the cover of darkness to avoid photographers. The extraction syndicate had successfully drained millions from his offshore accounts over a span of months. They provided absolutely zero medical benefit in exchange for the vast sums of capital. The charlatans waved goodbye, perfectly content with their profit margins. He arrived at a small, poorly equipped clinic in Juarez for the surgical intervention. The facility lacked the advanced life support technology standard in modern American hospitals. The sterile environment was a stark downgrade from the pristine sound stages of his youth. The actor signed the final release forms, legally absolving the surgical team of any malpractice liability. He was willingly walking into a highly volatile, life-threatening industrial procedure. The surgeons prepped him for the large-scale incision across his failing chest. They warned him that his weakened heart might not survive the heavy doses of anesthesia. The actor accepted the risk with the same cold calculation he used on the movie sets. He viewed the surgery as a final desperate stunt to regain control of his biological autonomy. The alternative was to suffocate slowly in a hotel room while the studios counted their money. He closed his eyes as the chemical sedatives flooded his bloodstream. The rugged cowboy persona had been entirely stripped away by months of systematic exploitation. He was simply a terrified, exhausted laborer, hoping the mechanics could fix a broken engine. The surgical team picked up their scalpels and prepared to open the damaged chassis. The final physical violation of his body was about to commence. The corporate bosses in California received confidential updates regarding his surgical plans. They monitored the situation purely to prepare the necessary public relations statements. They drafted eulogies and calculated the potential bump in their quarterly revenue reports. The executives felt absolutely zero moral responsibility for the man bleeding on the operating table. He was a defective product undergoing unauthorized repairs. The Juarez Clinic operated in complete isolation from the Hollywood power structures. There were no studio fixers present to manage the crisis or manipulate the narrative. The surgical team functioned entirely as independent contractors, performing a high-risk extraction. They sliced through his sternum, exposing the catastrophic damage inflicted by the industrial machine. The internal landscape of his chest was an absolute biological wasteland. The tumors had fused heavily with his remaining healthy tissue and vital organs. The surgeons realized the orthodontist's claims of cellular regeneration were absolute fabrications. The cancer had multiplied exponentially during his time at the unregulated sanctuary. The surgical team proceeded to carve away 5 pounds of necrotic, cancerous mass from his abdomen. It was a savage medieval excavation of a completely ruined biological system. The procedure stretched for hours under the harsh, uncalibrated clinic lights. The surgeons fought desperately to separate the tumors without severing his major arteries. His heart rate fluctuated wildly as the anesthesia warred with his weakened cardiovascular system. The doctors essentially dismantled his internal structure to remove the suffocating pressure. They threw the toxic byproducts of his Hollywood career into a stainless steel medical bin. The physical trauma of the operation pushed his body to its absolute mechanical limit. He was no longer a superstar. He was a fragile compilation of failing organs and severed tissues. The surgeons finally stitched his ruined chest closed and transferred him to a recovery room. They had successfully completed the extraction of the tumors. Now they could only wait to see if the engine would restart. The recovery room lacked the sophisticated monitoring equipment required for critical care. He lay unconscious, tethered to basic intravenous drips and an outdated oxygen regulator. The harsh reality of his situation stripped away all remaining illusions of power. The millions of dollars sitting in his bank accounts could not purchase a clean breath of air. The wealth generated by his labor was entirely useless in the face of physiological collapse. The Hollywood public relations machine maintained its calculated, profitable silence. They continued to sell the myth of the unbreakable icon to the adoring public. The contrast between the marketing materials and the biological truth was a masterclass in corporate deception. The studios ensured that the toxic legacy of their sound stages remained entirely hidden from view. The blame rested entirely on the frail shoulders of the man fighting for his life in Mexico. The next 48 hours would determine the final outcome of the industrial experiment. The surgical team monitored his vital signs, waiting for his nervous system to reboot. The damage inflicted by the asbestos, the narcotics, and the fraudulent clinic had compounded into a fatal triad. The human body is a resilient machine, but it possesses finite limitations. He had officially crossed the threshold of irreparable structural failure. He briefly regained consciousness in the dimly lit Mexican recovery ward. The searing pain in his chest was sharper than any stunt injury he had ever absorbed. His lungs struggled desperately to inflate against the fresh surgical trauma. He stared at the ceiling, completely isolated from the empire he helped construct. The silence of the clinic was a deafening contrast to the roar of the studio lots. The nurses recorded his vital signs with cold professional detachment, treating the former cultural icon as just another critical patient with a highly unstable heart rhythm. His blood pressure plummeted dangerously low as the shock of the surgery settled into his nervous system. The doctors administered heavy coagulants to prevent internal hemorrhaging from the deep incisions. His biological reserves were completely depleted by the decades of continuous corporate extraction. The irony of his geographical location was perfectly cruel. He built his entire fortune playing American heroes who conquered the desolate, unforgiving frontiers. Now he was physically trapped in a barren border town, stripped of all his manufactured power. The studios had successfully extracted his youth, his labor, and his health for maximum profit. They left him hollowed out, discarded, and waiting for the final mechanical failure. The executives back in Los Angeles slept soundly in their gated, secure estates. Their ledgers were perfectly balanced, and their legal departments had successfully insulated the corporation. They had orchestrated the perfect, untraceable industrial disposal of a compromised asset. The actors' desperate flight to Mexico provided the ultimate cover story for their negligence. The Hollywood extraction machine simply moved on to the next disposable laborer on the assembly line. His cardiovascular system fought a desperate, losing battle against the severe surgical trauma. The heart muscle had been relentlessly strained for decades by chemical stimulants and exhausted by severely diminished oxygen intake. It simply lacked the structural integrity to survive the shock of the invasive biological excavation. Blood clots began to form silently within his heavily compromised circulatory pathways. The biological engine was shutting down gear by gear in the sterile Mexican silence. The clinic staff recognized the catastrophic drop in his arterial blood pressure. They scrambled to administer emergency stimulants, plunging needles directly into his failing veins. The synthetic adrenaline failed to ignite a response from the completely exhausted cardiac tissue. His lungs, heavily scarred by industrial asbestos and ravaged by the recent scalpel, refused to expand. The monitors beside his solitary bed emitted a flat, continuous electronic drone. The fatal incident officially concluded in the early, isolated hours of the morning. His physical form ceased all mechanical function far away from the flashing cameras of California. He was permanently eliminated from the corporate roster at 50 years old. The rugged cowboy who had outrun countless cinematic villains could not outrun a systemic biological collapse. The most expensive biological asset in Hollywood history was now officially expired. As the heart monitor flatlined in Juarez, the ultimate cruelty of the macho trap was fully realized. He had spent his entire career proving he could withstand any physical punishment the directors demanded. He had swallowed his pain, hidden his coughs, and silently absorbed the blunt impacts. He believed this silent endurance was the absolute ultimate expression of his working-class strength. In the end, this ingrained psychological stoicism only facilitated his own fatal poisoning. If he had openly complained about the toxic dust, he would have been labeled difficult and immediately replaced. If he had refused the cheap racing suits, the studios would have sued him into bankruptcy for breach of contract. The system was specifically engineered to punish any laborer who prioritized their own biological survival. He played by the corporate rules exactly as they were written, and the reward was a premature grave. The industry did not just extract his labor, it actively weaponized his own pride against him. News of his demise crossed the southern border and hit the executive suites with lightning speed. The studio bosses did not pause production or observe a single moment of genuine silence. They immediately activated a pre-planned, highly coordinated public relations apparatus. Press secretaries distributed carefully sanitized eulogies directly to the international wire services. The corporate priority was controlling the media narrative before the medical realities of his environment could leak. The official obituaries highlighted his rebellious spirit and his tragic battle with a rare disease. They deliberately omitted any mention of the unventilated sound stages or the cheap fireproof safety gear. The public relations departments framed his illness as an unfortunate twist of unpredictable genetic fate. They heavily emphasized his history of cigarette smoking to deflect any potential corporate liability. The corporation successfully blamed the laborer for his own fatal industrial poisoning. The moment his heart stopped beating, his financial value to the system actually increased. A living actor requires complex contract negotiations, percentage points, and expensive on-set accommodations. A deceased icon requires zero overhead and generates pure, unadulterated profit margins. The studios immediately cracked open their vaults to aggressively re-release his entire cinematic catalog. The marketing teams plastered his face across fresh international advertising campaigns within hours. Theatrical distributors organized highly lucrative retrospective screenings of his most famous Western properties. Television networks deliberately altered their broadcasting schedules to air highly rated marathons of his earliest work. Every single broadcast generated fresh revenue streams directly into the corporate bank accounts. The executives monetized his fatal incident with absolute chilling industrial efficiency. They turned his highly publicized funeral into a global merchandising opportunity. They printed his stoic, rugged likeness onto millions of promotional posters and apparel items. Consumers eagerly purchased the pristine image of the invincible American hero. They were completely unaware they were buying the heavily curated portrait of a poisoned, exploited laborer. The royalties flowed continuously, entirely detached from the physical suffering required to build the brand. The Hollywood extraction machine had perfected the exact science of profiting from the grave. The executives who authorized the dangerous production schedules attended his memorial services in tailored suits. They offered hollow condolences to the press and wept on cue for the surrounding cameras. These were the exact same men who calculated the precise cost savings of using lethal building materials. They faced zero legal consequences for engineering the toxic environments that ruined his cellular structure. The justice system was never designed to prosecute corporate manslaughter committed on a soundstage. In the immediate aftermath of his fatal incident, the studios quietly restructured their insurance policies. They recognized the looming threat of long-term occupational illness across their aging, exposed workforce. Corporate lawyers drafted complex new liability waivers for all incoming cast and crew members. These documents legally bound the laborers to assume all risks associated with chemical exposure on set. The executives weaponized his death to tighten the legal trap around future generations of workers. They also initiated a silent, gradual renovation of their oldest filming facilities. Construction crews working in full biohazard suits were brought in during the dead of night. They secretly stripped the toxic acoustic materials from the ceilings to prevent further contamination. The studios never publicly admitted this was a necessary corrective safety measure. They simply labeled it as routine architectural modernization to avoid arousing any public or legal suspicion. The hypocrisy of this secret cleanup operation was absolutely staggering to comprehend. The board of directors acknowledged the lethality of the sound stages only after their greatest asset had been eliminated. They protected the infrastructure, but they strictly refused to compensate the human beings already infected. The corporate logic dictated that acknowledging past negligence would destroy shareholder value. Human life was permanently subordinated to the sanctity of the quarterly dividend. Decades after his physical elimination, the brand name continues to generate millions in annual revenue. High-end automobile manufacturers and fashion houses license his likeness, marketing the rugged aesthetic at premium prices. His face remains permanently plastered across billboards by men who have zero connection to his physical suffering. The actor's name has been systematically stripped of all its human context and reduced to a pure commercial logo. The ghost of the exploited laborer is still working overtime for the corporate masters. This lack of accountability introduces the most terrifying variable in the entire Hollywood equation. He was the reigning monarch of the box office, generating unprecedented wealth and global cultural influence. He possessed the financial resources to hire specialized lawyers, private doctors, and international fixers. Yet the corporate system still managed to poison him, bankrupt his health, and discard his failing body. He was eliminated just as efficiently as a broken lighting prop. If the undisputed king of the box office suffered this gruesome, unprotected fate, the reality for the nameless crew members was an absolute slaughter. Carpenters and electricians breathed the exact same toxic dust, expiring quietly in modest suburban homes without global eulogies, immediately replaced by fresh union recruits. The stuntmen who shared the cramped, asbestos-lined vehicle cabins absorbed the exact same chemical trauma. They wore the cheap fire-retardant suits without a fraction of the financial compensation or global glory. When their lungs failed decades later, their families were left drowning in insurmountable medical debt. The corporations successfully denied their workers' compensation claims, citing a convenient lack of direct evidence. The systemic erasure of these blue-collar tragedies remains the darkest, most fiercely protected secret of the era. The illusion of the Western myth relies entirely on hiding this grueling, lethal reality from the consumer. Audiences demand a clean, triumphant narrative where the strong survive and the righteous prevail over adversity. The studio system fed them this fabricated mythology purely to keep the ticket counters busy. They brilliantly disguised a ruthless, predatory labor camp as a glamorous factory of dreams. The public eagerly swallowed the fantasy, completely blind to the mounting casualty list behind the camera. This is the horrific paradigm of the legendary golden age of cinema. The men who actually built the industry's wealth were treated as nothing more than disposable scaffolding. They erected the glittering empires of Los Angeles using their own fractured bones and contaminated lungs. When the towering structures were finally complete, the laborers were systematically pushed off the ledges into obscurity, the studios kept the billions, and the workers kept the tumors. The final evaluation of this tragedy leaves no room for Hollywood romanticism. On screen, Steve McQueen was completely invincible, but in real life he was just another number on the expense sheet of the studio bosses. Hollywood was entirely willing to pack the lungs of its most expensive superstar with toxic waste, purely to save a few dollars on the set. The demise of the King of Cool stands as the most chilling indictment of the golden era's absolute inhumanity.